This is Goth. No, wait a minute. This is Goth. Sorry. This is Goth? Why is it so hard to pin down a definition? Now, if we travel back in time, decade after decade, or even thousands of years, what comes to mind might be vastly different. Cybergoth, romantic goth, hippie goth, gothabilly, Visigoth, Ostrogoth, how can all these be goth? It's confusing, right? But what's even more intriguing is that despite this seemingly fragmentation, goth has been an undeniable force in the cultural world, a nuclear bomb of aesthetic that's had enormous ripple effects across film, fashion, and especially music. Yet, over the years, I've often wondered if this often misunderstood subgenre is declining, becoming less visible, or evolving into something entirely new. So today I'm going to explore the history of goth, its current state in today's world, and its future. So let's dive into the question, whatever happened to goth? Hi everyone, my name is Otto, and welcome to Exits Examined. We'll be exploring the lives of people, companies, and more after their prime time has seemingly come to an end. If that sounds good to you, there's a like and subscribe button below. Alright, let's cut to the chase. I want you to take a good long look at today's media landscape. Movies, music, fashion, social media, whatever. Now answer this. Has goth died? Now, it might seem like it should have. From pretty much the moment it was born, people pretty much assumed this was just going to be some dumb, fleeting youth trend. And yet decades later, it continues to linger on the fringes of culture and occasionally, just occasionally, even dominating it. Take, for instance, the 2022 Netflix series Wednesday, which takes some pretty heavy inspiration from goth culture and has become a massive hit, spawning viral TikTok dances. And if you look around at music and fashion particularly, you'll see that clearly goth has not disappeared. In fact, it seems to be experiencing a resurgence in many ways. But something feels different this time around. But to understand what's changed and where we're at now, we need to first all get on the same page and answer the deceptively simple question, well, what exactly is goth anyway? Well, let's take it back to the basics. Goth is a subculture that emerged in the late 70s and early 80s, deeply rooted in post-punk music, which evolved into the gloomier and more dramatic genre now known as goth rock. The goth subculture encompasses a diverse range of music genres and subgenres, as well as a unique fashion sense, drawing inspiration from punk, glam, and even historical periods like the Victorian era. Fashion-wise, although there might not be a ton of variation in terms of color, there is variety in pretty much everything else, especially textures, with things like corsets, velvet, silver, and in fact, androgyny would be a huge part of what makes goth goth. Even though not all goths adhere strictly to the fashion, it is undeniably an important part of the subculture, along with the general aesthetic focused on themes of death, darkness, the supernatural, and the occult, pulling influences from horror films and vampires and 19th century literature. The goth scene itself thrives on social interaction, and this makes sense because it was built around music. Events, meetups, coffee houses, festivals, and of course nightclubs. Goth would not exist without this vibrant sense of community, with music almost always being at the heart of these. But to say goth is just a genre would be a gross oversimplification. While its meaning varies from person to person, for many it represents a sanctuary of self-expression, and the best thing about it, in my opinion, is that there's just room for so many different types of people in here. Teenagers who love sadness? Check. Middle-aged men who want to dress up in Victorian outfits? Check. Anyone of any age or gender who wants to play with makeup? Double check. Goth is welcoming to all. Well, in most regards, but we'll get to that more later. Now, some of you out there might be screaming at me with the question of how the heck did goth go from this to this? Now, I don't want to get too bogged down here explaining, so here is a world-famous, quick and dirty, Exits Examined breakdown of a topic that could fill multiple YouTube videos in itself. Is everyone ready? Goth boots and chokers on? Alright, let's go. Thousands of years ago, the Goths, a Germanic people, played a pivotal role in the decline of the Roman Empire. Divided into Visigoths and Ostrogoths, it was the Western Visigoths who initially clashed with Rome, initiating decades of complex relations marked by alternating periods of trade, cooperation, and warfare. This culminated in the sack of Rome and the fall of the Roman Empire, granting the Goths control of vast territories spanning from Germany to the Black Sea. This event marked the onset of the medieval period, and the term Goth came to be associated with barbarism, destruction, and the decline of civilization. In this vein, during the Middle Ages and Renaissance, Gothic came to define an architectural style characterized by pointed arches, ribbed vaults, and flying buttresses, exemplified by Notre Dame. Coined by Italian humanists of the Renaissance who cherished classic Greek and Roman art, the invention of late medieval architecture was mistakenly attributed to the barbarian Goths, and the term was initially used to throw shade, criticizing the style's perceived harshness compared to the refined simplicity of classical and neoclassical designs. Some considered it the most disgusting thing ever and encapsulating the very loss of culture caused by the destruction of Rome, which is ironic in a way because actually Gothic architecture has almost nothing to do with the OG Goths. In the 18th century, Gothic found new life in literature, designating a genre of fiction steeped in darkness, mystery, and supernatural elements. Frankenstein and the works of Edgar Allan Poe stand as quintessential examples, and don't worry, our man Poe will be prevalent in Goth culture for pretty much ever. By the late 19th century, Gothic had become synonymous with all things eerie and terrifying, and the term itself was first used in 1967 by a music critic to describe The Doors, foreshadowing the true Goth explosion of the following decade, which brings us nicely to the 70s. The 70s is where Goth truly became the modern-day Goth subculture we know and love. As artists sought darker sounds, post-punk was born, and by 1979, bands like Susie and the Banshees were pioneering a gloomy, atmospheric style that would become the cornerstone of an entirely new genre. Bauhaus's single Bela Lugosi's Dead marked a kind of starting point for the burgeoning scene. This sound, coupled with the dramatic aesthetic of big black hair, dark makeup on men and women, and clunky shoes, would start to solidify the emerging subculture's aesthetic. It was a stark rejection to the capitalist values of city yuppies and conformity, and in direct contrast to the power dressing of the era. Gothic garments were shapeless and, at least at the time, often DIY. The makeup with the pale face and exaggerated dark black eyes and lips is almost like a mask-like appearance, so all really radical and cool stuff for the time that kind of mixed and mashed all these different ideas and concepts, from anarchy to punk to kink, that even exists to this day. And oh my god, if I could go back in time to any club in the world just once, it would be London's Batcave in 1982, which became the hub for the scene. With its cobweb ceilings, the club embodied Goth's creative spirit, and it was a space where music, style, and aesthetics converged. But Goth's influence was spreading far beyond just London. By the late 80s, Goth music infiltrated mainstream radio, and the subculture's unique blend of music, fashion, and horror aesthetic had firmly established itself in popular culture. This widespread recognition solidified Goth status as a global phenomenon, setting the stage for its continued evolution and enduring appeal. And it became, well, maybe not accepted by everyone, but people at least knew about it. That's not to say it was unchallenged. The satanic panic was quick to point to Goths and literally scream. But for most people, the appeal was simple. Wear black, embrace moody music, dabble in paganism, and watch your relatives' disapproval soar. What wasn't there to love? But just like with anything, the more popular it becomes, the more precarious it becomes. The 90s and early 2000s were transformative years for the Goth subculture in both good and bad ways, characterized by both a solidification of its aesthetics and an expansion of its influence into the mainstream culture. Goth would permeate everything from games like Vampire the Masquerade, high fashion with brands like Alexander McQueen, and even Hollywood with movies like Underworld, Edward Scissorhands, and The Crow, which brought Goth aesthetic to an even broader audience. And this right here, I think this is such a fascinating moment. That moment when, well, in lack of a better word, Goth became profitable, and this would of course change everything. Now, who could forget about Hot Topic and Spencer's? No matter how you feel about them, they made goth fashion easily accessible, and this commercialization led to the emergence of the hated mall goths, a term used to describe those who adopted the goth look primarily for its aesthetic appeal rather than its deeper cultural significance. This was nothing, though, compared to the tragic Columbine High School shooting, which marked a significant turning point for the goth community. The perpetrators were initially misidentified as goths, leading to an increased scrutiny of goths in general at the time. This misunderstanding forced many within the community to alter their public interactions and adopt a lower profile. This saw goths becoming more insular with a heightened sense of gatekeeping to preserve the authenticity and safety of their subculture. On top of all of this, the very foundation of the goth scene, music, was changing wildly at the time. The rise of industrial and electronic music in goth clubs brought a new energy and controversy to the scene, as some goths sought to preserve the genre's punk roots. This brought even more fracturing within the scene as the whole Satan thing got co-opted by other movements, and cybergoth emerged, which blended goth aesthetics and rave culture. Now, don't get me wrong, the goth scene did not vanish entirely. However, a confluence of factors contributed to a general sense of decline. The scene splintered, the rising popularity of emo and other alternative subcultures drew people away, and the accessibility and commercialization of goth imagery diluted its impact. Speaking personally, though, the 2010 goth era holds a special place in my heart, and I think the people who were really into it at the time were just all about it in a very beautiful and less polished, less perfect, but ultimately kind of more authentic way, but it might just be nostalgia. So, okay, that was all a lot, but that finally takes us to the current day. And what exactly is goth in the current day? Well, goth, once defined by a thriving underground scene, has undeniably changed. A huge reason for this has been the decline of nightlife as a whole since the mid-2000s. Now, this can be slightly confusing because I don't mean to say that goth music or festivals have been on decline, because actually, musically, the 2020s have seen a resurgence from great bands all over the world, and the festivals are as awesome as ever. But as far as physical spaces and nightclubs go, I think in most cities, it's safe to say that they are on the decline. Rising prices, older generations having more responsibilities, and younger people seemingly having less interest in drinking and going out are all contributing to this. COVID-19 drove this even further, leading to the closure of many beloved clubs and venues, and in general, it just feels like third spaces are just on the decline, and for community subgenres like goths, this can be a huge issue. But it's not all bad. While physical spaces like clubs may be declining due to shifting social preferences and economic pressures, the digital realm has become an even more important hub for goth. Sure, there were incredible 2000-era websites, but younger generations raised online have embraced digital platforms as primary social spaces, leading to a resurgence of goth communities on platforms like TikTok, Discord, and of course, Instagram. And it's hard to overstate how radical of a change this is, and the internet as a whole has been. It's just so much easier to access goth music, fashion, history than ever before, but this can be a bit of a double-edged sword. On the positive side, there's a vibrant online community fostering creativity and connection. However, it has led to a rise in, well, thirst posting and superficial engagement, making the scene appear disingenuous to some. This goes hand in hand with the rise of goth and NSFW content as well, and it's tough because goth, sexuality, and BDSM has always had crossovers, but the whole, big titty goth GF thing and sexualism can be problematic because if you're using a subgenre's aesthetic to boost your own sales, that's pretty insidious and dangerous to the integrity of the subgenre as a whole. But I guess, after saying that, it's actually no different from what some fashion brands have been doing for decades. But of course, it's not just that though, because fetishizing a group of people can of course become very problematic. Now, you'll see a lot of criticism for superficial goths, which sparks debate about authenticity and gatekeeping within the community. Gatekeeping in Goth has always been a bit of a contentious issue. On one hand, it serves to maintain the subculture's integrity by ensuring that newcomers are genuinely interested in its music and ethics. On the other hand, excessive gatekeeping can be seen by some as elitist and making the scene inaccessible, deterring potential new members. In the broader cultural context, though, Goth has become more mainstream and more accepted, especially compared to the 80s and 90s, with dyed hair, piercings, and tattoos being pretty common nowadays. Goth quote-unquote fashion is even more accessible to everyone now. I mean, it's crazy to think about, but goth fashion is now literally an incredibly lucrative business, with brands like Dolls Kills and more exploding in popularity, which is a far cry from goth's DIY roots. But it's not fair to say that that's a bad thing. Many creators are genuinely invested in the community and their pieces are amazing, so it definitely goes both ways. So let's all take a deep breath. We've gone from this to this. So what does it all mean? It's clear that goth is far from dead, though it has undeniably transformed over the years. Has it lost some of its edge? Well, the shock factor has died down a bit, and the sanitized nature of the online world, where content is often restricted to what's suitable for a younger audience, limits the raw, rebellious expression that characterized early goth culture. But that sense of community, creativity, and self-expression that has always been central to goth remains vibrant. Goth has evolved, and despite some fears that the scene is dying, which would have been voiced as early as the 80s, it just looks different, but that's to be expected. Change is a natural consequence of musical evolution, cultural shifts, and the impact of social media. Sure, there are downsides like memes, over-sexualization, and people using goth for aesthetic only, but the echoes of the original culture are all here. For example, DIY today might look different, but that's because it could include 3D printing an outfit together, and the coffee house might be replaced with a Discord server. And this change is reflected in the very heart of what makes goth, the music. Goth events are still happening all over the world, from Electroworks in London to goth nights at the Cat Club in San Francisco. New sounds and looks like techno are being thrown in all the time. There's this mix of different music genres, aesthetics, ages, and it's beautiful to see in a way, though this evolution can sometimes clash with more traditional goth gatherings. But it does highlight a fundamental aspect of goth culture, its need to continually push boundaries and upset the status quo. So all this got me thinking, what is it about goth that has led to its enduring appeal across decade after decade? It's interesting because in general, subcultures used to be considered more exclusively for youth, but nowadays many people are into them well into older ages. And I think this is one of the best things about goth, is its general acceptance. No matter what age or gender, it's a haven as a place for self-expression, as well as its adaptability. And it's just so awesome to see a place where you can see a mix of almost every age hanging out together. Sure, every few years it undergoes a significant transformation that's going to ruffle some feathers, but I for one am eager to see what comes next, and I don't think goth is going to go anywhere anytime soon. Thanks so much for watching. I really appreciate all the support as I try to get this channel off the ground. And a huge shout out to my patrons, you guys are the best. If you want to do more to support me, feel free to check out my Patreon link in the link below. As always, if you ever have any suggestions about what you want me to cover next, feel free to drop a comment below. It's always really interesting to hear what you have to say. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.